translating resilience and SMNR into effective actions for freshwater biodiversity. And I can see you and hear you at the moment, so it's all good.
Good. Okay, well, that's a start. Right, so let's crack on. So basically the idea of this talk is thinking a little bit about resilience and SMNR, which are fairly abstract concepts, and trying to put those into something practical that we can do on the ground, and thinking about what we can do in terms of fresh waters to get them better and to get them more resilient. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is not new, and probably a lot of what I'm going to talk about you'll think I knew that already, but maybe certainly from my point of view anyway, it's more about sort of putting it all together and trying to think about it in the round and how these things link in. So I'm sure most of you on this will be familiar with the Environment Wales Act 2016, and that it talks about resilience and trying to maintain and enhance biodiversity, and it provides some general ideas as to what resilience might be, and in particular diversity between and within ecosystems, connections between within ecosystems, their scale, their structure and functioning, and their adaptability. Now, how can we start to think about this? Well, I think certainly, I don't know so much about other ecosystems, but certainly in fresh waters, we have a bit of a habit of thinking an awful lot, not really about resilience, but about pressures, and about all the things that are going wrong and all the things that are affecting them. And in particular, we talk an awful lot about water quality. And that's not always helpful, actually, because I think there are other things that we could do. So here's a sort of a big list of some of the things that tend to get talked about an awful lot. When you think about rivers or lakes, you think about pollution, agricultural land management, development, discharges, climate change, water abstraction, plastics. And it all gets a bit overwhelming. It's very difficult to start to think how you can make a difference and how you can actually turn anything round or improve anything, because a lot of these things are outside of our control. And that's kind of represented by this slide here. It's a bit like this is Hercules fighting the Hydra on the left, and this is Sisyphus rolling his rock up endlessly for all time on the right. A lot of these pressures do require continuous management. They're always there, and very often they rely on human behaviour as well. They rely on people doing the right thing, and most people doing the right thing in the right way most of the time. And unfortunately, I mean, you know, most humans are not perfect, absolutely not. And people make mistakes, you get accidents, you get people who aren't aware of the latest guidance, as well as people who just, you know, don't really care as much. So thinking about this, I'm going to partition this up a little bit. So obviously, you know, there are the water quality elements, there are the catchment side of things. I love this picture. This is from the West Country Rivers Trust. This is kind of like the Beer Street and Gin Lane. On the left-hand side here, you've got lots of bad stuff going on in the catchment. You know, cows grazing right up to the riverbank, and the manure heap in the wrong place, and, you know, sort of dense, dark coniferous forestry and so forth. On the right, you've got a much better managed system with buffer zones and so forth. What I'm mainly going to be focusing on, though, today is this bit, the actual freshwater habitat, what it's like, what's the important things in it, what processes are going on, and how we can help those processes to work in our favour and work in the favour of biodiversity. So are some freshwater habitats more resilient, less pressure sensitive than others? Well, yes, they are. Here's a nice example. This is the central arm of Bosheston Lakes in Pembrokeshire. This is a really fabulous place. You know, you can look through the water there, and it's absolutely gin clear. And one of the reasons why it's gin clear is because it's low nutrients. And one of the reasons it's low nutrients is because of this lot. These are charophytes, which are a kind of good algae, I suppose you could view them as. They're quite a complex species of algae, and they like clean water, but they also help to keep the water clean. and you can find them in dune systems as well, by the way, to link back to the previous project. You've got such a dense bed of them here that the nutrients in sediments can't be resuspended by things like the wind or fish rooting around or ducks or what have you. And so it locks those nutrients in. They also provide cover for algae-eating water fleas. Living in the water column here, there will always be some phytoplankton, little microscopic algae, and water fleas, cladocerans, are things that love to graze on them, things like Daphnia. But Daphnia are also favourite fish food, and so they need somewhere to hide during the day. And of course, these plants are also directly removing nutrients from the water column. So this is quite a resilient system. As long as these stoneworts are here, they're acting as a kind of buffer. They're sucking nutrients out of the water column, locking them in the sediments, and preventing the water turning green. And of course, this is what happens in the eastern arm of Bosherston Lakes, which has been heavily phosphorus polluted over the years. You've got the opposite set of problems. You've got mobilised sediment, you've got very little cover, you've got nasty green water, and you've got some invasive species, actually some Canadian pondweed as well coming in, and filamentous algae. Now, what's interesting about these two habitats is that the threshold for them tipping from one to the other, so for that, oops, let's go back, that turning into that is not the same. There's a resilience here, which means that if you are here and you chuck in some phosphorus, initially it will get absorbed. And so you need a higher concentration of phosphorus to turn from that previous one into this than to go back again, because here this habitat has very little resilience. And we can see this as a general theme in freshwater habitats. There's quite a variety of different pressures and bits of aspects of resilience, where we know that there is a sort of a buffering effect, and here are a few examples. Obviously, we know that for acidity, if you have a base-rich geology, limestone or something, then your water body won't be acid sensitive, even if you have acid rain. We know I've just talked about lakes and nutrients, but another thing is shallow water. If your lake is shallow, there's more light penetration, and so it's harder for those phytoplankton to become dominant. If you're a river and you have problems with nutrients and or climate change, so it's warming up, it's hotter, so it gets better conditions for algal growth, then riparian shade is actually really important for suppressing that algal growth and preventing those eutrophication processes kicking in. Similar sort of story in ponds. We know that they can easily become deoxygenated if you have, in this case, the opposite way around. If you have very heavy tree cover and a lot of leaf fall going into them, and if you keep them open, they don't suffer from those kinds of problems. So, going back a little bit to resilience, one of the things that started me off thinking about resilience in a little bit more detail was this creature. This is a freshwater pearl mussel. Freshwater pearl mussels are pretty amazing. They can live for 100 years or more. They're declining quite rapidly. And they have this really interesting complex life cycle. They'll live on the riverbed, often in very large beds, and you can get them living in sort of very pristine rivers up in the north of Scandinavia. You can get beds of pearl mussels that can be 3 deep and basically cover the entire riverbed. So these can form a habitat in their own right, and I think that's really important. They have a short-lived parasitic phase in water, and then they're attached, they're parasitic to trout, on the gills of trout, and then they'll drop off after about 6 months. And they need to live in clean, stable gravel for about 4 to 5 years. And that's the problem, because many of our gravels are not very clean, and the ones that are clean are not very stable. And so this prop phase, it means that pearl mussels are not recruiting. This is the kind of gravel I'm talking about. They're stable black gravels, and they provide habitat for these juvenile mussels here. But they're also good for other things. They're good for lots of types of invertebrates and for fish spawning. So pearl mussels are important there. They're an ecosystem indicator species. They're an ecosystem engineer. They provide ecosystem service filtration, and they're an aspect of resilience that we've lost in Wales in freshwater. So going more generally onto rivers, what do we need to be thinking about? There's often this kind of mystical view of freshwater resilience that we need to think about processes, and then hardly anyone ever talks then about what those processes really are, and how we need to think about them. So this is obvious. Everyone knows this, right? Rivers are about flow, and about flow of water, but they're not just about flow of water. They're also about flow of sediments, and that means silt, sand, gravels, pebbles and cobbles, and even larger material to some extent, and of course woody debris as well. And I think the big message in rivers is, generally speaking, that we need to slow all these things down. We've been spending a lot of time on land management, trying to get as much water off land as possible, and the result of that is that many of our river channels are too big, they don't flood enough, and there's too much silt and sand and gravels being washed out and washed down them. And again, this will come on. So starting in a river, and think about headwaters. This is something that's really quite rare. This is a photograph of just a natural rill in a headwater. This is on one of the Causa Clean, the Clean Fens, and it's fabulous. It's this beautiful little sort of branching system here, little stream. This is in quite wet conditions. You can see there's another branch going off in this direction. It's grazed by ponies. It's got quite a nice range of interesting plants in it and animals in its own right. But this is a lovely little headwater because it has flow for most of the year. It's a fairly intact wetland. It's good water quality. So this is the kind of thing we need to see a lot more of around Wales. And unfortunately, far too much of this is being ditched and straightened. So this will be too dry. It releases this water much too quickly. That causes flooding downstream. And very often it's rather improved as well. And so there's too much nutrients and sediment going in. Headwaters are also pretty vulnerable to climate change. This is my little local stream, and these are two photos of it. This is it at a kind of normalish sort of flow. But this is what it looked like in spring this year, and what it also looked like in spring about 3 years ago, I think, when we had that very nasty drought. So these headwaters are under quite a lot of environmental stress. And I mean, climate change is no longer something of the future. It's something that's definitely with us. About the in-stream habitat, this gets really neglected as well. Again, we talk a lot about water quality, but we see an awful lot of damage to in-stream habitat. In particular, this is kind of historic damage in the sense that it happened often during the 20th century, or the worst excesses of it did. This is a Gwynedd Riverboard dredger taking out boulders from this section here. He didn't quite finish the job, thankfully, but you can see there's a big pile of boulders now along the bank. And, certainly when I first went here, I didn't think much of it. I didn't think necessarily that it was something unnatural. But actually, as you start to get your eye in, you can see, if you go along a lot of rivers, including ones that have very good water quality in upland areas, a lot of them will have some of these big boulders along the bank here. Now, you might say, okay, well, it's just a few boulders. Does it really matter? What difference does it make? Well, boulders are pretty important. Have we got the video, Adam? So this is, again, this is something that we all know, and I hope you'll be able to see this. It's not quite coming through for me yet. I mean, it's just a photo of a stream flowing. You've got a nice big boulder there, which is squeezing the flow. But you can see here, there's all this turbulence. This is just the flow from upstream. It plunges down into this little mini pool. You get all this turbulence, variability in flow, and that's oxygenating the water. Fresh waters don't oxygenate very easily. They don't hold that much water, much oxygen rather. And so this kind of turbulence, where you're stirring it around and mixing it, is incredibly important in fresh waters. And obviously, when you take out boulders and woody debris, you reduce the amount of turbulence and you're reducing oxygenation. Okay, we can stop the video now. Okay. So all that turbulence does other stuff as well, because it's not just water that it's affecting, and it's not just the oxygen. it's also helping to sort sediment. You've got different speeds, flow speeds that are within a certain section of the river. This is a wonderful photograph from a chalk stream taken by the Wild Trout Trust. And unfortunately, what's not quite in the photograph, there's a big lump of woody debris just upstream here, and that affects flow speed. So in this section here, you've got faster flow, and you've got a sort of gravelly substrate. A bit slower here, that allows some plants, some water crowfoots here to take hold. Here, it's a little bit slower still, and you've got a whole load of sort of bits of woody material which have fallen off the wood that was placed in here. And then right in the margins here, you've got some silt. Now, all of these, that within about, I don't know, a metre or two, you've got 4 different microhabitats, and those will all support different kinds of riverine animals. You have lampreys in here and burrowing mayfly nymphs. Here you might get the real things that like the fast flowing water. There you might get a bunch of gammarus, freshwater shrimps. So you're immediately creating a whole load of habitat diversity. And similarly, but those boulders that were taken out, they were trapping a load of gravel. And we've already seen how important gravel is. That gravel is salmon and trout spawning habitat. There you can see, and it's also the home for those baby pearl mussels. Down in under the boulders, you'll get a little bit of a sort of bit of scour underneath. It's a great place for fish to hide from fish-eating birds, for example. You'll get some really nice oxygenation going on here with that turbulence. And large woody material here, as we've already seen, that has the same sort of effect. And so these kind of trees that half fall into the river are brilliant cover for fish and provide lots of food source for all kinds of animals and plants. And they're helping to trap gravels and do all that sediment sorting. So really good habitat quality. Well, moving on from the in-river, we'll go on to the riparian zone. Obviously, as the trees are important here and they link in, this isn't really a very good riparian zone. And that's probably the main thing that's wrong with this river, is it's heavily grazed up to the edge of it. And so you can see you've got sort of things like some bank erosion going on here. It's very open as well. Any fish that are living in there are liable to get cooked during a drought. And you can see there's some very low flows as well, and really not a lot of cover. If you look at somewhere that's a bit better, this is the part of the lower Towie, you can immediately see there's a lot more diversity here and a lot more good things going on. You've got more shade and cover for fish. Again, you've got some plants here, a bit of cover and nectar for insects, all those river flies when they come out of the water to breed, beetles and so forth. You've got some nice exposed riverine sediment. That's really important habitat for all kinds of rare inverts. And then here you've got this eroding earth cliff. A bit of bank erosion is absolutely fine, and it helps provide sand and gravels for the river. And obviously you've got nesting habitat for things like kingfishers and sand martins. If you don't have a good riparian zone, you're much more vulnerable to things like this, which is heavy growth of filamentous algae. And that can certainly be helped by release of nutrients at certain times of year or very warm weather. But it's surprising where this can turn up. This was actually in an upland stream. Riparian zone is also important for things like ponds, and in fact ponds are all about the riparian zone, about the edge effect here. This is a really nice pond in the Wrexham area, and well, I mean, what I want you to note here, I mean, there's a bit of a mixture of different habitat types there, from sort of short and tall, and that provides a really nice diversity of habitats. And something that I would encourage you to have a look at is how you fence your ponds. Traditional conservation pond fencing, if you're going to do fencing, tends to be something along this line. So here's your pond, and here's your fence. You fence out half of it or some fraction of it. And this tends to get a little bit overgrown, and this tends to be heavily poached. And this sort of recent development is what you might call the 4 seasons pond fencing. Obviously, your pond is going to fluctuate a little bit in water level. You have, and there'll be a sort of a winter water level that might be about there. This end is still overgrown and this end is still poached, but if you fence tighter, so fence to about the summer water level here, so you have really sort of short vegetation, but still a sort of little bit more diversity, and that fence line is about at the winter water level, or about a cow's neck length, I suppose, then you'll still get some grazing here and there, but you'll just get a little bit more diversity on your individual ponds. Or, of course, if you wanted to, you could create 4 ponds and fence them in different ways. Well, what about flooding and floodplains? Flooding is obviously a very contentious issue, and flooding is a very frightening thing. This is some quite spectacular flooding that occurred during the summer of 2007. This is a team at Ludlow, actually, it's not in Wales. And you can see, like most flood waters, it's carrying an awful lot of silt. Now, generally speaking, silt's a problem in a river because silt obviously can, if that gets deposited on gravels, it can clog them, cause fish eggs to die, kill off any bugs that are living in there. So we don't want loads of silt in the river, but although, as we've already seen, if the river has a little bit of some boulders and some woody debris in it, it can process that to a certain extent and deposit the silt in sort of meanders and so forth. Now, here's what should happen with flooding is that, and this is the Towie again. The Towie is spectacular because it's got this really nice floodplain, and so all that muddy, silty water comes out of the river and gets deposited on the floodplain, and the silt there settles out, and it provides some free fertilizer to the farmers there. So these fields, this is what it's more or less the same area is like when it's not in flood, and it manages to get rid of a lot of that nutrient-rich material, and it's not going to clog up the river as much. But of course, I mean, it's worth saying. I mean, the floods need to be in the right place. You don't want certain bits of land. It's okay to flood, and certain bits of land, it's obviously you don't want flooding. We don't want people's homes flooding. We don't want towns flooding. We don't want key infrastructure flooding. So this is kind of what I mentioned just now. The other thing, reason why floodplains are important is that, as we saw in that photograph of Ludlow, there's an enormous amount of energy during floods, and if the river can't flood, if it's got sort of high flood banks along it, for example, you get more and more scours, you get more and more energy. And gravels and sands get mobilised, they get washed out of the river, and presumably, I mean, we don't really know because it's obviously far too dangerous to try and sample the river during those periods, but presumably fish and invertebrates are getting washed downstream and killed as well. So basically, if the river can flood, if all that energy can be dissipated out onto the floodplain sideways, it's almost like allowing the river to exhale. Floods also create floodplains rather also have a lot of habitat complexity and diversity. They're incredibly biodiverse in their own right, and probably they're some of the habitats that are in most serious trouble. There are very few intact floodplain meadows or woodlands left in Wales, and of course they can provide ecosystem services by helping to prevent more serious flooding downstream, because if you have your flooding in the right places, then it prevents flooding elsewhere. Freshwater diversity. Well, just moving across now to think about those principles that we thought about at the start, which are to do with the Environment Wales Act. So freshwater diversity, we can think about in-channel flow diversity. Have you got things that will create that? Boulders, woody material, riparian trees, a windy channel as well. That will help create that. And if you've got that flow diversity, so you've got little areas of fast flow and areas of slower flow, you can also create that substrate diversity, which means it's well sorted, and you create those microhabitats for all those different animals and plants. It also means that even during a drought, you'll have little areas of fast flow, and that helps to keep the oxygen levels high. And that's a time when things are in most stress, so that's when rivers need their oxygen. You obviously, as riparian habitats and floodplain habitat diversity, tremendously important as well. Anything that can be contributed towards those is a bonus. I haven't talked a lot about connectants. Obviously, up and down river connectants, things like fish migration passageway is very important, and it's something that I think we've got fairly well covered. There's certainly been a lot of work being done both by NRW and Rivers Trusts on this area, so I think I'm not going to talk about that very much. And the riparian and floodplain connectants as well is something that we need to think about, and we need to think about the river as being something that's not just in its channel, but that is something that links completely to the riparian and floodplain habitat. At a scale, again, catchment management, we need to think at multiple scales, but let's start with the basics. Let's start with the building blocks. Fix the in-stream riparian. If you've got control of 100 meters or 200 meters of river, you can make improvements to it, and it all contributes to resilience. You won't be harming it, but yeah, if you're a river manager and you're able to think in more of a strategic way, then build up in chunks, follow a plan. Obviously address barriers to migration, and think about catchment level problems like gravel supply as well, and water quality, of course. Structure and function is very important, and I hope I've sort of helped to address some of those structure and function things. Again, they're kind of the same or the flip side of some of the things I've already spoken about. And about those processes. And of course, water quality is still important, especially in standing waters. And generally speaking, the slower flowing a river is, the more like a standing water it becomes, and the more sensitive it is to water quality issues. Adaptability, I'd say rivers are very adaptable. Other freshwater ecosystems maybe not quite as much. But I think people often have quite firm views of what rivers are like and what rivers should be like. And sometimes it's, often it's more about talking to the local people and the local community and discussing what you want from the river and what can be achieved. I mentioned this stage 0 restoration. Sometimes you have river channels that are so damaged that really they can't be restored used by just sort of fiddling at the margins. And one thing that's been tried in the US is actually filling them in completely and letting the river find its own way again. This is obviously quite a radical thing, and we need an awful lot of agreement and consents and so forth. But I think it's something that shouldn't totally be ignored in some cases. What do we want more of? Well, my sort of headline really would be, I think we need more intact headwater wetlands. There's already been loads of great ditch blocking work gone on, but I'd also like to see not just blocking ditches, but also recreating natural rills and other drainage pathways, so that we're getting something that really looks a lot more like a natural wetland and not just a sort of intact patches of peat with horrible straight lines going through them. We need more in-stream boulders and woody debris, woody material. And we need more riparian broadleaf woodland and other low-intensity habitats. The woodland in particular is important because obviously it can supply some of this woody material. We need better connection to floodplains and secondary channels. And we need more clean water ponds as well. So many ponds are not in good condition, and we also have far fewer ponds than we used to. So I think I'm going to finish up there. And I'll just leave you with a photograph of something that's a wild river in Europe. This is the Fiume Tagliamento in Italy, and you can see a lot of the good things happening here. I think one of the most interesting things here is that this is a multi-thread river, and I think that thinking about secondary channels and side channels and these kind of little sort of lake, floodplain lakes and so forth, that will then act as flood relief channels when the river comes up, is very important. Although obviously I'm not expecting us to have anything quite like this in Wales. So I'll leave you close to where we started with the freshwater pearl mussel, which I think for me is the poster boy of freshwater resilience. Thanks very much.
Okay, lovely. Diolch yn fawr iawn, Tristan. So oedd hynny'n diddorol iawn, of course. So that was very interesting. So we do have time now for a few questions. And before we do that, I'm going to just mention what would have been in this 10-minute slot. So I just want to flag up that Isabel Macho from Carmarthenshire County Council has got a video that will be available on the WOVA platform about the project that she is working on. And I think she would have been in this slot, but then the time wasn't quite enough. So it actually makes perfect sense to go on and have these questions for Tristan. So I've got a copy of them here. First question's from Gethin, and he's asking, and I'm not quite sure what point this was in response to, but Gethin is here, so he might be able to clarify. And he's just saying, so just is the promotion of woodland planting along watercourses a good or a bad thing?
On the whole, I think it's a good thing. We know that climate change is affecting our rivers. We know that many of our aquatic plants and animals need cool temperatures, and we know that woodland helps to provide shade from sunshine and therefore keep temperatures cool. Cooler temperatures mean more dissolved oxygen in the river, and also woodlands provide a lot of cover independent of that sort of thing. So I think by and large it's a good thing. That's, and obviously there's things to do with the woody material and so forth as well. I would encourage, native broadleaf woodland as being a really good thing to do. Conifer plantations are a bit of a different kettle of fish, because traditionally conifer plantations have been planted at very, very high density. They provide rather acidic sort of woody debris that doesn't break down very well, and often conifer plantations have quite large drainage channels in them, which affects the hydrology. So there are some slightly different things there. But that's not to say that you can't design conifer plantations, beg your pardon, that are pretty river friendly.
Okay, great. And on to the next question. So this is from Matt Brown. He's asking, in relation to the Avon Eden, you showed the pictures about the dredging and the removal of boulders from the 60s. He's asking, why were the boulders removed from the rivers like the Eden?
That's a very good question. I think I don't have a definitive answer to that, I must say, and I don't think records were really kept as to why a lot of these things were done. Looking at the photos, there's a chap sort of standing posing by one of the photos, who looks like he's dressed in kind of +4s and a sort of ghillies type outfit. So I'm wondering whether it was done at the time by an angling club to create pools in the river, to make angling easier. And I don't think the farmer would have objected either, because potentially it might have been viewed as something that reduced any risk of flooding. I don't think either objective has been very successful, and I think but to be honest, in terms of why it was done, often it was just done because it was viewed as something, and I don't think there was a really clear document that explains why things were done.
Okay, yep, you're gonna like the next question. So putting you on the spot. This is from Sue Colwell. What are your thoughts on beaver reintroduction, please?
This is a hot topic. This is a very interesting one. I have very mixed feelings about beavers. I think the issue is not so much that beavers are obviously a native species, and if we had good quality rivers everywhere, I think I have absolutely no issue with beavers being reintroduced. I think the problem we've got is that actually rivers in Wales are not in a great condition, and in particular we've got a real lack of riparian woodland, and beavers are essentially a sort of a woodland management animal. The Wild Trout Trust took and I'm not a member of them, by the way, but they recently released a release which was quite an interesting one, and I think which sort of chimes with what I feel, that they want to see more rivers fit for beavers. And I think the concept there is that really we'd like to see rivers in good condition with plenty of riparian woodland, and once you've got that, then you can have beavers as part of that ecosystem, and they would bring benefits. I think the risk is that if you have beavers in a damaged environment, such as some of our more intensive rivers, that they cut down a lot of the riparian woodland that's there and exacerbate nutrient problems by trapping nutrients in the river and making them more open and therefore prone to algal growth. So they're not. I wouldn't see them as a silver bullet, but I think they can be very useful, and obviously they have a really big impact on the ecosystem. And if the ecosystem is already good, they can make it better. Ooh. Sorry, I lost a bit of power on my monitors for a second. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
It's a challenging question to answer. So yeah,
it's not simple.
That's good.
I mean, I will say that I think that in terms of fish migration and stuff, I'm not vastly concerned by beavers at a catchment level.
Okay, yeah, great. So we are going to draw this to a close now. We've just coming up towards 12 o'clock. So diolch yn fawr iawn eto am pawb. Mae wedi bod yn mor diddorol I clywed am y safleoedd gwahanol a weld y lluniau a bob dim. And dwi'n siŵr mae pawb yma wedi mwynhau hefyd. So it's been really interesting to see the sights and the pictures, and I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed it.